Good evening, everybody. My name's Fiona Crosby, and I have two roles to perform tonight. The first is to propose a vote of thanks, and the second is to facilitate Q&A. So as to the first, as you know, in events such as this, the person who proposes a vote of thanks usually raves on in eulogistic terms, sometimes at considerable length, emphasising the quality of the speech and the speaker. Well, now, on this occasion, I don't propose in any way to depart from that hallowed tradition. But before I do so, I just wanted to reference Mr. Keating's quote from Oscar Wilde earlier this evening, because I'd like to share an even better quote with you, if I may, Mr. Keating, and one that I believe is far more apposite to the occasion. It's the remarks that Prime Minister Disraeli made after his regular catch-ups with Queen Victoria. And he used to say that when flattering royalty, you should lay it on with a trowel. And so I figure that in the presence of political royalty, I know you will find that ideologically irksome, Mr. Keating, but I propose to lay it on with a trowel. So can I just start by thanking you for an absolutely spectacular address tonight. Thank you. For many of us, it was just tremendous to be reminded of our relative good fortune, economically and socially, and to be reminded of the role you played in all of that. But also you're reminding us that we need to not be too distracted by what's happening domestically, and there are a lot of distractions at the moment, but to keep looking outwards, to liberate our imagination, to think big and relentlessly focus on inclusive growth. So thank you very much indeed. Now we're going to kick off the Q&A session. There is a bit of a protocol. All the usual rules apply. If you wish to pose a question, you need to make yourself known in order to attract a microphone. Then if you could just introduce yourself. We're not going to stymie freedom of expression, but could we ask that soliloquies are distilled and that the emphasis be on posing questions. I'm going to start with one, if I may, as a warm-up while people are refining their thinking. In your introductory words, Paul McClintock, you talked about the concern that was the widening gap between, on the one hand, the growing case for reform, but on the other hand, the public's dwindling appetite for it. And that reminded me of something Laurie Oakes said when he retired as a political commentator some months ago now. And he recounts many a phone call from Mr. Keating when he wrote an article that met with Mr. Keating's displeasure, and he would receive these calls, and there was a certain absence of subtlety in the message that was imparted. But he said that once things had calmed down, he learnt an enormous amount from those calls about the economy, about the importance of vision, but also the importance of communication. And he says that what you used to talk about was the importance of developing long lines of logic, very long, straight lines of logic that could go on for many years. And with them came lines of rhetoric. And it was only by doing that that you could fold in policy after policy and take a nation with you on your big thinking. So I thought maybe you could start with that, and that would respond perhaps to the problem you posed at the outset, Paul.
Well, it was very kind for Laurie to say that. Bill McMahon could never say the letter R. And of course, he used to say on the set, and this morning he said, I had a meeting with Mr. Lottie Oakes, and he said such and such and such and such. And of course, For years we called Laurie Lottie. Not years, 30 years. And of course he hated this, you know. So sometimes if I'd open one of these conversations with Lottie, you know, I get the right note moving at the right moment, you know. But I think, look, if you are not indignant, you may as well not be in the game, you know. I remain indignant about a lot of things, you know. Even silly Peter Garrett trying to grab hold of the domain. You know, I mean, you take these jobs on as a vocation in reality, you know, and the project consumes you. You know, the project is what carries you along. So attacks upon the project or lines across the trail of the project have to be reacted to and resisted. They are not rebukes to a journalist. They are the affirmation of the project's importance. Right? So therefore, you know, one in a big program like this, if one doesn't have a righteous purpose, you will never actually do it. So therefore, doubters, questioners, or obstacles have to be removed, dealt with, discussed, or run over. Right? Because it's not, these issues were never about me in a personal sense, but they were about the project, you see, the national reconstruction of the place. And you know, in the ons and offs of public life, you've got to take the brickbats with the bouquets, you know, and I did that. But for the better minds in the gallery, and Laurie Oakes was certainly one of those, they would always profit from some exposition of your position. You know what I mean?
Well, he did comment on just how much he benefited from those expositions, but I think he was saying something more in relation to your ability to capture the imagination of a population, not just the press gallery.
Well, see, I take the view, you see, people say today, you couldn't do the reform today that we did then, you know, the social media and the Twitters of this world. This is just not true, you know. If there is a guiding light, most conscientious communities will follow it. But there has to be a guiding light, you know. There has to be a sort of moralism, a sort of an ethical clarity to the way the government conducts itself. And if leaders talk up to the community and not down, and I always tried to talk up to people, and I did the talkback radios and all the rest. Basically, I always assumed whoever I was talking to could have been in the cabinet room, so you give them the same kind of quality of answer. Then a conscientious community will follow you. Will do the things with you. You know, and I think you look today. You look at you know, I often look at the ABC News each evening, and you've got Alan Kohler and sometimes other people on the ABC who do the financial report. You just would never see this in most countries. You know, I mean, what we taught people in the 80s and 90s is to understand that the economy is the giver of the goods. You know, and that therefore its twists and turns and quirkiness really mattered to us all. You know, so. Yeah, when you see the charts on overnight about commodity prices and gold has gone up and silver's gone down and, you know, all these things, exchange rates have moved, etc. People are putting this away. And now, particularly when they have assets, I mean, one of the things I always wanted to do with ordinary people was let them into the big wealth machinery by owning stocks, you know, by owning and getting dividend income, right? And now they get them through their superannuation funds. And they've got their apps and they see what their balances are and they see what the mix is of, you know, overseas equities, Australian equities, bonds, property, etc. They're into it. So they're very, very sharp and they're conscientious. And I think the legacy of the teaching years has been we've got a very economically educated community.
Okay, well, thank you. So the lessons are we need to talk up to the community and remind them that the economy is the bearer of great good. I'm going to leave it there. Sorry, I've just got all these people wanting to pose questions.
Mr. Keating, Peter Ryan from the ABC. Given that we've had 27 years of continuous economic growth, we have these political distractions that are on. There are issues to do with certainty that come from both sides of politics. What are your concerns about the way that the world is viewing Australia at the moment, given those concerns about certainty? Do you see any issues there at all?
Oh, I don't think it would have, to be honest, captured much of the world's attention, to be honest. I don't think so. I mean, look, all of these things, the status of a member of parliament in the legislature, and of course the status of a member in the executive government does matter. Whether the decisions of the government are legitimate because the person making them may not be eligible to be even a member of parliament. Of course, all this matters, and these issues arise. But I'm trying to lift you guys to a higher plane tonight. It's always a struggle, I know.
We have another question over here.
Hi, Paul. As a UK citizen coming over here for the last few years, I congratulate you on your hindsight in terms of things like superannuation and so forth. And, the UK took that on, so the guaranteed, or also the mandatory level 20 years plus after the social reform that you looked at. So, well done on that. Is there anything, and you were clearly a visionary leader in these aspects, is there anything that you found really difficult to get through? And you talked about that earlier, but is there anything you regret in some of the visionary areas that you looked at but you couldn't get through?
Well, I made a point today, someone asked me in The Australian a day or so ago about superannuation. I mean, this was a great disappointment to me. You see, what the structural changes did is that they doubled trend productivity. We used to have trend productivity of about 1.4 or 5% a year, about 1.4, and by the 1990s we had about 2.8 or 3%. That meant that we had rising unit labour costs, but we also had rising profits, and they were both paid for by productivity. So the superannuation was actually, and the real wages growth was paid for by productivity. It didn't come out of the share of profits in the economy. It's another way of saying in an expanding cake everyone is kind of happy. Because we had such a huge secular change in productivity, we were able to actually increase people's real wages while they were paying up to 9 or 10% of their income into superannuation. Right? So they never actually noticed that they had any diminution in cash pay or available cash. This was done, of course, in the accord processes with the AC2U, and in the last one I had, I was going to pay 3 percentage points of wages as tax cuts, but pay them as savings, not as cash, right? In the 1995 budget, I had 3% of wages going to everybody's superannuation account, paid as savings, not cash, and I had the agreement of the AC2U that working people would agree to co-pay that by 3 percentage points. So we had 9 under the SG, plus 3 from the tax cuts, plus 3 from the co-payment, which took us to 15. At 15%, the country, I mean, we're already at 2.3 trillion of assets. We'd be now touching on 3 trillion. But more than that, people born in the 1940s and early 1950s would have had a pool of assets moving into retirement, which knocking off the 6% denied them. The first saving in Peter Costello's first budget was deny those tax cuts to superannuation, and with that, of course, the 3% co-payment fell over. The end result was broadly, the baby boomers in Australia missed out on the accumulation, which they should have had. So the rise in stock markets from 2003 to 2008, and then from 2012 to now, would have been a huge accumulation for them. And apart from that, the adequacy of 15% would mean that everyone in the country who joined the workforce at 25, say, and retired at 65, would go out on about 80% of their retiring salary. That is, and that we call it a replacement rate of 70 to 80%. We can't do this now at 9%. It's just 9.5%. It's just not adequate. It's just not large enough. It's good, but it's just not large enough. So that's the big disappointment I had. Had I won the 1996 election, that would have happened. We also would have been a republic. Yeah. And we would have, the popularity of the republic in 1995 was 72%. So those things you ask about disappointments, we've all got disappointments in public life, but the big brush changes are the ones I miss most,
Mr. Keating, thank you. Leanne Cutcher from the University of Sydney. I appreciate your analogy of the crowbar and the reforms that you have achieved for us, which has been very welcome. And I want to ask you, do you think that the environment itself is the crowbar of our time? So in a sense, we have a government that is engaging in what we might call protectionist policies for certain industries. And I want to ask you, do you think that the environment is the crowbar of our time?
The crowbar, you say?
Yeah, the crowbar, as you used it yourself to describe your own reforms.
You mean using the environment to achieve policy changes, you mean?
No, I mean the environment itself weighing down on us and requiring us to achieve policy reforms that we seem reluctant to engage in as a country.
So just to clarify, I think when Mr. Keating referred to crowbar, it was the method by which the metaphor was by which he cracked open our economy and exposed it to the world.
Yes, I understand that.
So your analogy is...
I understand that. Mr. Keating used a crowbar, and what I'm suggesting to Mr. Keating is that the environment itself might be the crowbar of our times.
I see your point. Well, the global commons are going to matter to all of us, whether it's climate change, nuclear proliferation, the state of the oceans are going to matter to us all. And it's foolhardy for us to believe that global warming is not a consequence of human activity. So a rational state supports policies which sees radical changes to the conduct of carbon abatement in this case, and that's what the Paris Accords were about. That's what the carbon tax was here about before it was removed, and this was a right and rational way to move down, I think, the policy path in respect of climate. Perhaps the most important state in this is China. China is now adopting green policy as a matter of social policy as well as economic policy. It's also adopting it as a matter of entrepreneurial policy, where cleaning up the Chinese landscape, its water and air, becomes an economic task and a measure of economic growth. And it is now the leading state. It's not necessarily the leading state in the adoption of the principles. Some of those were adopted by the European states earlier. But in terms of scale and impact, China's going to be the leading one. It's more the pity, of course, that the United States, under President Trump, has withdrawn from the Paris Accords. But the climate change is not. The climate change issues are not going to go away, and we've had a very unhappy period with this. You know, from the defeat of Kevin Rudd as Prime Minister over this issue, then Julia Gillard's carbon tax, the defeat of the carbon tax by Tony Abbott, the inability of Malcolm Turnbull to do anything about climate substantially, has meant that Australia, instead of being at the forefront of all this, is now lagging behind. This is a country like this, with such a proud record of change, should be doing better than this, you know, much better. So you could be right that climate is an atmospheric that may lead to further policy changes, and in a rational state, in a rational country, that should happen. And one hopes to hear enough rationality exists to see carbon abatement and substantial climate renovation.
We have a question just here.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Thank you for your presentation. Ross Womersley from the South Australian Council of Social Service. You were talking about digital transformation, and you were talking about the ideas of inclusive growth. And of course, one of the issues is that there are many people who are already being locked out of the world because of digital transformation. I'm interested also in this idea that you used around how we constructed indices on the nightly news that talked about the economy. I wonder if you have ideas about what indices might be relevant if we're talking about trying to bring to the population a measure of inclusive growth, and how we might put that on the news on a nightly and a weekly basis.
Well, the mere fact that we talk about the economy means we are aware of its importance in generating prosperity, real income growth, and as I said on my feet, the bottom 20% decile of people have had this dramatic increase in real living standards, including with direct Commonwealth payments which have been targeted, and with the backgrounds in access and equity in health, in education, etc. So these things are there, but the microprocessing opens up a whole new universe for the world. And it's a universe based on knowledge, fundamentally. And it's going to, as I said on my feet, it's going to lead, I think, to a far flatter, rather than, we've all lived our lives in silos. In most of the industries we've lived in silos, in tops-down managerial silos. I think these are going to give way to a far more collaborative, flat, interactive kind of world. And in that flat interaction, ordinary people through the technology have a chance to play. Where in the old silos, if you were in it and at the top of it, things were fine, but if you were not in one, things were pretty lousy, right? So I think there's a liberating quality to the technology that countries like Australia should both proselytise in and technically make available. And it may be that the foreboding about disruption and employment replacement is right, and we have lots of unemployed people. But of course, in other economic transitions and technological transitions, this has not been true. You know, look at the size of our service economy today. It's touching nearly, 77% or something of GDP. So, and you can just see with Uber and the Airbnb, which I mentioned on my feet, you know, you've got spare resources now being used. You know, so one of the people you may refer to may be, say, a single woman in a 3-bedroom house who now has got 2 bedrooms that she can put on Airbnb. Or alternatively drive the car at night and be a Uber driver. I'm making this up, but all I'm trying to say is that I think that the opportunities of the technology, the propagation of the technology should be a high national objective. And if it were to be a high national objective, then I think a lot of people who have wallowed in certain places may shift. Now, it may mean others are displaced, but that's why I think we have to then think about what we do here. Now, whether it's a program of negative income growth or whether is to be seen. But inclusive growth should be a primary objective of policy. It shouldn't be a fallout. It shouldn't be a residual, you know. And it was a primary objective in the 80s and 90s, and I've said on a number of occasions, you know, people talk about the United States, and the United States is the greatest democracy on earth, and it's been, you know, the 20th century was the American century. But this is a better society than the United States, easily. In access and equity in health, access and equity in education, a retirement income system. You know, the minimum award rate here is now $17.75. It's $7.40 in America, $7.40. And we don't shoot our children in schools, and if we do, we take the people away who do it. We don't let people shoot people in churches. You know, this amoralism in the United States is poisoning the place, you know. So we are a better society. We have done it better. But we have done it better because inclusion was uppermost in our mind, you know. But if we just let the smarties take the high points and the devil take the highmost, in the days of gearing, in the world of, you know, the world's awash with money, absolutely awash with money at very low rates of interest. And if we let those who have access to the gearing alone be the people who make the wealth and other people on fixed or falling real incomes, we're going to have a very divided country, you know.
Is part of the question about whether or not there might be a metric by which you can measure the inclusiveness of the growth rather than the growth?
Well, I don't know.
I
I don't know as a metric, but I think that you know, the normal household surveys of income about where people sit in the pecking order is right, but they are because we had an express policy. I mean, you know, Australia does have the best system of minimum award rates in the world, you know. That means that people are not left, you know, huddling over a railway grate in winter to keep warm, you know. They're not, you know, out on the street. So I just think that if you can interest the community in the national project, and the national project is inclusive, then you get big compliance. And if you get the big compliance, you have a lot of policy opportunity.
I'll follow. Is there a question over here? Someone?
Matthew Claughton. Apologies, there's a little bit of repetition on what you just spoke about, but sometimes when I'm using Uber
We're 3 minutes out of time, so if we maybe skip the repetition.
Yeah, sure.
And straight with a question, that'd be great.
So you've taken an optimistic view on digital and technology. Do you see things like Uber and Airtasker as risks to undermining sort of minimum wages and the EBA sort of status that we have? And do you think something like universal wage or income is a possible solution for that?
Well, it may be that in countries like Australia or the United States or other Western countries or Eastern countries, in that matter, if these technological changes are so disruptive that we move to that sort of a system. But the sort of flatter collaborative world where people relate to one another and do things for one another and have things done for each other, rather than having their goods and their life wholesaled, whether it's news or opinion or whether it's goods, is a world we've never even hoped to dream of. As I said on my feet, the world has always been run in regions and in sectors. Now we're running the world in real time in one place. So why would any of us want to go back to the regions and the sectors, you know, and why would we resist the opportunity that the technology is offering, right? Now, there may be teething problems. Uber drivers may be ripped off, but they'll only happen to a point, then they'll leave. You know, they'll give it away again. They'll go and get a taxi plate, you know, or something like that will happen. Or the same will happen with your air taskers and the rest. But I'd rather us embrace the change than resist the change on the basis that the resistance will keep pockets of prosperity we have now, which may be just illusory, you know.
Well, I think that's all we have time for, and that's
Do a bit
nice...
more.
Well, consistent with your almost closing words of embracing change, not resisting change, let's embrace an extension then of, what do you think, 7.5 minutes?
Okay.
Okay, let's go. Another question. Diane.
Thank you. I'm Diane Smith-Gander, CEDA Board and immediate past President of Chief Executive Women. So that's a hint on what's coming now. That was amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you for my super. I enjoy it very much. But equity and inclusion... Indeed. Sometimes as an Australian woman, I don't always feel included and I don't always feel equity. So can I borrow your imagination? I want to borrow your imagination. If you were given the task of saying, how could we make all Australian women feel that equity and inclusion and drive the economy that way, what might be some of your policy prescriptions?
Well, I don't know. That's a hard question, Diane. I don't know what the policy prescriptions are, but when we exclude the creativity of half the population, we have to be moving backwards. You know, that's for sure.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Next question, please. Okay, over here. A question over here.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. My name's Rebecca Tompkinson. You spoke of boldness and creativity, and I wondered if you could comment on how important a creative arts industry is and investment in that industry is to delivering on that.
Say that. Creative arts, yeah.
How important investment in the creative arts is to our boldness and imagination.
Well, I've said all my life that the arts are central to a country, you know, and many people don't understand that, and the reason they don't is that they've never had a sort of dramatic moment. Dramatic's not quite the right word, but perhaps, you know, a feeling or romantic moment with the arts themselves. If one opens oneself up to the arts, it will always lift your imagination, you know. Now, I've said over and over the years, and people do think you're pulling their leg, I said, you know, I renovated the Australian economy with my two best friends, Mr. Marler and Mr. Bruckner, you know. And of course, in truth, I did. In truth, I did, you know. You know, music to the mind, if I talk about music, music is the highest form of the arts. Music to the mind is like electricity to an electric motor. Once the music rolls in, the mind just gets into, you know, these fantasies and excitements which lift your capacity to imagine things better. And I'm here with a young man here tonight who said that his whole career was built off the back of Gustav Mahler and Mr. Bruckner, and that he owes these two people more than he owes anyone at a university or anyone else. And this is so so very true. Now, whether it's the music or it's the graphic arts, or it's it's dance or it's poetry or it's theatre, these are the things which lift us up, right? If there is no transcendental world, these are the highest points of our civilization. Now, we'll never quite know till the moment arrives whether there is a transcendental world, but the arts have got to be the highest point near it. I'm trying to find the right word, but the sort of crossover point, the sublime. The word sublime comes from subliminal, just below the limit, below the limit. So that's where I think the arts are, and I think any country that spares an interest in them or fails to encourage them is a country which doesn't appreciate what it is.
It's interesting your answer focuses on what the arts can do by way of uplifting an individual. Another great man of history, Tolstoy, he talked in terms of art uniting people, which interestingly wasn't part of your answer expressly.
No. Well, there's lots of great authors out there. You can't mention them all.
I think we'll go to the question over here.
Mr. Prime Minister, thank you. As perhaps the only Yank in the audience, maybe not, I was fortunate last week to have a breakfast at Julia Gillard, and tonight here I am with Prime Minister Keating, talk about philosophical opposite ends of the world. My serious question, as a driving force in APEC, do you foresee a time in the horizontal nature of our economy on the planet when there's a real need for a global governance and how that would work?
Well, I think in the post-1947 world, when the United States was at the zenith of its power, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific, and multilateralism was really de rigueur across the world, with the Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral arrangements in Europe, which have come, of course, to be later, more obviously, the European Union, and, of course, general multilateralism in the, let's call it the American alliance or the American structure. I think this was a wonderful period of the world. It's lasted about 70 years. But the Americans lost the threads of it after the Cold War, the decade of triumphalism in the 1990s, the unipolar moment, Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History, it's all over, we've won. Jeffersonian democracy is going to win the day. Market principles are going to win. The Washington Consensus is number one. That all went down with the financial crisis in 2008-9. American prestige collapsed with the financial crisis in 2008-9. And the Chinese, who have a completely different and Confucian sense of themselves, with a different place in their mind about hierarchy and authority, that don't believe in Jeffersonian structures of democracy, have produced the great economic miracle of all time. And so much so that the conceit that the Americans could run the international economy blew up in 2009, and the Chinese stimulus that they embarked upon has provided, according to the IMF, 61% of world growth since. So the Chinese are not going to find themselves in some proprietary strategic structure run from the Atlantic by the United States. That's all over. We're now going to a bifurcated world where global governance is going to be perhaps much more about the nation state and its representations in places like the United Nations, but are not going to be bindings of states in alliances of the kind the United States has had in the past. So if you listen to that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, you'll always hear him say, What we need is a new system of global governance. What that means is not a US system of global governance. So I think it's too early to say. I think we're going to see the bifurcation between the West and the East. That's very clear. The Chinese now developing their own institutions, which is the AIIB, the Silk Road Fund, all these various things. But globalisation is a very compelling notion, and the complementation of goods and services that globalisation brings is producing a sort of bindings in the world that probably are more important even than the political overbindings that might have existed in what's called global governance in the past. So while I think the United States missed the opportunity of bringing states like China and India and Russia into the construct after 1989, after the wall went down, while I think they missed that opportunity, what may happen now through globalisation is that we get some sort of netting going anyway. The Chinese believe in globalisation, but they don't believe in globalism. They don't believe in globalism. They don't believe in a block strategic structure run out of the Atlantic. So we're going to see much more. We're going to be a return to a world of a much more identifiable world of independent nation states, of big power rivalries, of a kind we last saw at the end of the 19th century. And that's why the relationship between China and the United States is so important here. And frankly, the relationship between Russia and Europe is so important for the same reason.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Sadly, we have to wrap up there. I have a small gift from CEDA to give you, Mr. Keating. It's, I think, ostensibly to say thank you for this evening, but I think more broadly it can be seen as a gift. I hope it's pretty good, by which we express our gratitude for many decades of enduring economic and social growth. Thank you very much for your time tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.